we're very delighted to have Kristen Grauman be our invited speaker for this afternoon. She's a professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Texas at Austin, and her research in computer vision and machine learning focuses on visual recognition and search. Before joining UT Austin in 2007, she received her PhD at MIT. She is an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow and a Microsoft Research New Faculty Fellow, a recipient of an NSF Career and ONR Young Investigator Awards, the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award from the University of Texas System in 2012, the PAMI Young Researcher Award in 2013, and the 2013 Computers and Thought Award from the International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence. She's also a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers in 2013 and the Helmholtz Prize in 2017. So she has just about the same number of Best Paper Awards from top conferences in vision. I won't go through them all. And she's been extremely active in the vision and machine learning community, serving as an associate editor and the chief of transactions of pattern analysis and machine intelligence, and is an editorial board member for the International Journal of Computer Vision. She served as a program chair of the IEEE Conference on Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition, and this year will be program chair of NIPS. So with that, please welcome Kristen Grauman to the stage.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, be able to tell you about some of our work. I'm going to be talking about problems in learning to recognize objects and scenes and activities in images and video. Okay, to start off, I think this group knows very well how exciting the successes have been on the front of visual recognition. Things that we didn't think were going to happen 6 or so years ago have happened, and we've seen how big labeled data, deep learning, GPUs all came together in a really exciting way to make this progress possible. Being able to recognize objects and images. So, as one great marker of that, of course, is the progress on the ImageNet benchmark, where 1,000 different object categories can be renamed in new images by using all the things you see in the top left of the slide. So this is very exciting. So an important question for us is to think about what's next for visual recognition. And one important question about that is to consider, how do our visual recognition systems learn today? So how do we teach them? Well, we tackle these problems thus far largely with traditional supervised classification. So we have images with their category labels, and then we learn how to reproduce those labels on new examples. So it's as if we're teaching the visual recognition system through flashcards like these, right? Here's 1,000 images of dogs, 1,000 images or more of boats, etc. And in fact, this has been prominent as a mode of teaching these systems for many years, and you can see that as demonstrated by this array of popular benchmarks in the field, all of which have this kind of interface with the learner, right? Examples and their labels. And this paradigm has been influential. Also, these benchmarks have done a lot of good for the field. There's also clear restrictions. So first of all, we know it's expensive to get this data. Fine. I mean, one could easily spend hundreds of thousands of dollars getting a new such large-scale collection. But even putting that aside, there's restrictions that occur that are a little bit more subtle. One is that we're teaching our recognition systems through what we can call disembodied data. These are images that are captured outside any physical context as far as they're presented to the learner, right? These are web photos that have been downloaded, they have their labels, and the system can learn from them. Secondly, there's the restriction in teaching this system this way that is implicit, which is these are well-curated photos taken by human photographers. So removed from the problem when we treat it this way is the fact that someone or some agent needs to know which photos to take, which moments in time, and how to compose or control the field of view. So contrast then, to kind of demonstrate this issue, contrast that with this. So I'm showing you here is an egocentric perceptual experience. You have it every day. Here's one where we see that real-world data captured by an agent from the first-person point of view has uncontrolled motions. It's a tangle of irrelevant things plus the relevant things. This suggests that part of the recognition problem is deciding on the camera control in the first place. Furthermore, this visual experience is inherently multisensory, right? And I just paused the audio because it was so multisensory it might be distracting, right? But you see what you see, you hear what you hear, you feel it, you smell it, etc. Furthermore, there's interaction, right? So the person or the agent capturing this visual experience is also allowed to interact with the environment, to touch objects, pick them up, put them down. Okay. So, if we contrast this with what we see, we have a path forward for the challenge in visual recognition, which is to move from the status quo of thinking of learning and recognizing in a very disembodied way towards a problem where we consider visual learning in the context of action and motion. Okay, so this is the big picture motivation for the work I'm about to share with you. And you can see how there's this mismatch, right? Training in disembodied snapshots on the top from web photos towards what we know happens in nature, which is agents that can learn in the context of their own behavior in the world, right? Who can learn from multisensory data, who can learn from an ongoing stream of observations. There's plenty of evidence from cognitive science that this is possible and necessary, but even if we don't care to have computational models that mimic that property, there's still good reason to pursue it, and that is that once our systems can learn in this ongoing multisensory way, they are free to keep learning in a very lightly or even unsupervised manner from ongoing observations. Okay, so this is the big picture goal that we're pursuing, and in the remainder of the talk, I'll show you two ways in which we're doing it. Okay, so how do we move towards embodied visual learning and recognition from embodied context? The first way, we'll look at how we can take unlabeled video to learn representations. The second way, then we'll transition from learning representations to learning policies for how to have agents move around intelligently. Okay, so let's look at that first one. And to start it off, let me motivate very loosely with some inspiration from cognitive science. So this is a famous study that some of you may already be aware of. Let me give you kind of the nutshell of what happened here. These scientists were studying the visual development of kittens, and these kittens were kept in the dark from birth, except for about an hour at a time per day, where they would sit on this carousel. And you'll see on the carousel that there's room for 2 kittens at a time. One of those kittens is the active kitten. The active kitten can control its motion within the restrictions of this carousel. The other one's a passive kitten, which is really just along for the ride. Right? You can see here that on the bottom of the right-hand basket, the kitten's legs aren't out. Okay. So what happens with these kittens and their visual development? In short, the active kitten, the one on the left, develops normally, whereas the passive one does not. It has detriments to its depth perception, its grouping, and other factors. So what's the message here to us? Well, they both saw the same thing. They both had the same visual experience, but the active kitten had that experience in the context of its own egomotion and its own decisions about that egomotion, which suggests that this really is a key element of learning a representation, not just looking at the photos, but experiencing the physical context of that looking or that exploration. So again, very loosely, we can take inspiration from this to pursue new modes of learning from unlabeled video. And so to start, let me show you how we have considered ways to learn representations that will exploit this link between egomotion, how the agent moves, and the surrounding visual changes. To do this, we take unlabeled video, and by unlabeled, I mean video that hasn't been touched by human annotators. So we don't have semantic labels about what's inside, it's just ongoing unlabeled video. And we'll take that with its accompanying signals about the motion of the camera. So this could be coming from other external sensors like GPS coordinates or inertial measurement units and so on. And we'll take these two streams of data and aim to learn a representation where this linking between how I move and how the visual surroundings change is well captured by the system. Okay, so that's the goal, learning this link. So let's think about why this could be beneficial. So to do that, you can put yourself in the shoes of our learner who is seeing some view. Now what we're going to ask is that the representation being learned be predictive of new views that could be seen if some particular egomotion were to be taken. So we look at this view and then we imagine some egomotion that moves the car from where it was looking at the top view to some new viewpoint. And if you, for a moment, stop and think, you can come up with some hypothesis of what this new view may look like. And in fact, here it is. Now, the question is, why could one do that? What factors have to be baked into the representation in order to make this kind of view prediction conditioned on egomotion possible? And qualitatively, we can see that it has to do with semantics because, for example, if we see streetlights, we expect a street below. Or it also has to do with the geometry. If we see a tree and we know it's in front of that tower in the back of the scene, then a rotation may occlude one with the other. It also has to do with other mid-level grouping cues like symmetry of this building. All right, so the idea then is if we ask a system to maintain the predictability of new views as a function of egomotion, then the resulting representation will have to have signals as well about these things, the semantics, the context, the geometry, relative depth, and so on. Okay, so then how we went about trying to learn such a representation was to pose this as learning an equivariant representation. And in particular, we take that unlabeled video together with these motor signals, which are external measurements about the motion of the camera. Here it's on the bottom, carving out the heading and of the vehicle on which this unlabeled video is captured, as well as its GPS position. And from that training data, we learn an equivariant embedding, and it's equivariant with respect to those egomotions. So equivariance is a generalization of invariance, which says that we don't want to discard these transformations G, which here G denotes an egomotion, but instead we want to organize them in the learned space. Okay, and so what this says is that we'd like to see pairs of frames from this unlabeled training video, which are separated by a similar egomotion, to have a predictable transformation relating them in the learned space. So if we learn a space like this, what does it mean? Well, it says the embedding we're learning Z will have this predictability or this organization across the egomotions such that we can relate these different motion changes to how things will look. So if our egomotions were things like left turns, right turns, going forward, then with respect to any new image we project into this learned space, it will be predictable how that image will look when we undertake those changes. Okay, or in other words, teaching in this learned feature space the ability to predict egomotion condition view changes. Okay, so what happens with this space? What can such learned features do for us? I'll just show you one snapshot result where we took unlabeled video here from video captured on a car. This is from the Kitty dataset, and they have samples like the ones you see here. Remember, they have no semantic labels in our case. This is just video. And then from them, we will augment with a very small number of labeled instances from a target recognition task. And here, it's a scene categorization task on Sun, where you need to say for a given image which of about 400 different scene categories does it belong to. Now, with the unlabeled video, as part of the training of the representation, the accuracy improves by about 30%, versus what we could get if we were only able to learn from that modest amount of labeled data. This is an exciting improvement because, one, practically speaking, this comes from just looking at unlabeled video, which we can do for free. And two, because it's a step towards having that kind of embodiment in place while we learn the representation and while we learn these categories of scenes. Okay. So let me show you then the next step from here. What we've seen is that we can learn representations with good benefit to recognition from unlabeled video if we pay attention to the embodiment, meaning the egomotion of the camera. But we were doing this still in a passive kitten sort of way, right? Because the video was played, the agent watches it and learns this space. So it's pre-recorded. Going from here, what we can imagine are agents that inspect objects, inspect scenes by moving around them, right? So it's not just whatever egomotions happen to separate the frames of the video, but it's whatever egomotions the agent chooses to make. And in fact, they could be complete. So imagine a robot walking around an object to start to learn about it, or holding an object and inspecting it from different views. So in a similar way, we can think about learning a representation that accounts for view predictability as a function of now any egomotion that the agent should choose. So if you think of a view grid representation on which we have viewpoints of this object in some regular sampling across all viewing angles, as depicted here, then a self-supervised task which we can provide for the agent to learn a good representation would be to take any single view of an object and be able to predict all the remaining views. So you can think of this as a one-shot reconstruction, given a single view, predict all the rest. And our key idea is to take this as the task that's, again, free to supervise just by inspecting these objects and knowing one's motion, and learn features that have rich semantics about shape in them. Okay. So why should they have rich semantics about shape? Well, we know that if we take dense sets of views, if we take many views, then reconstruction and imagination of new viewpoints can be treated as a purely geometric problem, like you see on the left. In contrast, if we ask for a space where new views are predictable from a single view, then this is where semantics, priors about the environment have to play a role, right? Because a single view is, by definition, ambiguous about the 3D shape. All these particular shapes shown on top of the right-hand side could project to create the same 2D image. And so that means that if we require to have a representation where the rest of the views are predictable, the signal that will have to be capitalized upon is these regularities about shape primitives. Okay. So taking this as the inspiration, we've been pursuing unlabeled data to learn features that we call shape codes. And you can think of this as a generalization of what I just showed you. Again, where instead of predicting from pre-recorded video, now we have view prediction that's possible from any arbitrary view. So during training, we see individual viewpoints, like the image of the airplane on the left-hand side. And then we build a network that's an encoder-decoder, so it's encoded in some way such that it's encouraged to be decodable into the full view grid of all possible views of that object. Okay. Now that full view grid is known to us during training, but at test time, we'll have only individual views, which are then mapped into the space. And so the reconstruction of all those views, as shown on the bottom in that gray array, this is the airplane now viewed from all possible azimuth and elevation angles. This is just during training. The representation that we gain from it is here in the middle, and that's what we'll use to encode individual views of objects. Okay. So this view grid is an implicit 3D shape representation. And it's important to note that there's no assumptions here about the canonical azimuth. It's unknown when we get a new view where on the viewing sphere it lies. And most importantly, we do this training in a category agnostic way. So what that means is there's not one of these models trained for airplanes and then another one trained for chairs and a separate one trained for cars. It's one model that'll be trained for all the objects, okay, without any labels. And what is this? What's the intention there? Well, this will, again, allow us to try to elicit those semantic shape cues, primitives, that help make new viewpoints predictable from limited data. Okay, so it's category agnostic, and that means then we can take it to represent new images. Here I'm showing you some recognition results, accuracy where higher is better, for 2 data sets with 3D shape models on which we've applied this idea, ModelNet and ShapeNet. And the task here is recognition of the objects using a variety of different methods for the representation, from a traditional autoencoder for the unsupervised representation to the embeddings that account for proximity and viewpoint with the Siamese network, and even the egomotion-based approach, which is shown here in purple. So using the shape codes that I just described, we get the accuracy you see in red. And this is an exciting step towards, again, having unsupervised feature learning that brings some embodiment, some notion of the physicality of these observations into the unsupervised learning process. Okay. And most importantly, I think about this result, these objects that are present while learning the representation are disjoint from those that are then we learn to recognize. Okay, in other words, not just the instances, but the objects. So you may have learned how to estimate shape codes from airplanes and tables and beds, and then use that representation to encode an entirely disjoint set of object categories. Okay. All right, so we've talked about feature learning from having awareness of egomotion, and then being able to expect certain conditions changing in the surrounding scene. In this one slide, I want to kind of flip that and show you how we can also think about how the changes in the surrounding scene help reveal something about the egomotion, and in fact, the complex egomotion behind the camera. And so in a kind of separate line of work, we've been looking at how we could take data from an egocentric camera. Here, it's a human-worn camera. You can see this person on the left has a chest-mounted camera. And we'll capture the video as they look out in the world. And our goal is to recover the 3D body pose of the person behind the camera. Okay. Now, certainly this is going to need to rely on some regularities about how the world moves around the person. A lot of the person is behind the camera. Very rarely will you see the arms and legs of someone who's wearing a camera. And nonetheless, as I'm just going to show you here, there's some cues about the egomotion that we see in the scene. And using it, we can learn, and we learn this in a supervised way, we can learn to recover the underlying structure of the 3D body. So what you're seeing here is the video captured from this chest-mounted camera on the left. In the middle is the ground truth from a Connect sensor looking at the person himself. And then on the right is the estimate that we can recover just by analyzing the video that you see on the left. And so you can see certainly, as a person moves their articulated body, we get signals from the surrounding scene that are correlated with the underlying pose. And this is, a promising step for us to have some high-level representation about the person's activity that's recoverable, again, just from the egomotion or observed scene motion. Okay. So again, to remind you, when we started, the big picture motivation was having embodied visual learning, such that agents, so far, get representations that aren't just disembodied from web photos, but really account for the embodiment, the action. And so far, that action and embodiment has been in the form of egomotion. Now let us think about that multisensory need. Okay. Right now, if we take traditional forms of learning about objects, they are visual and they're also silent. Right. But we know that there's rich information that's augmenting the visual experience all the time. For example, this might have been a visual or audio experience you had earlier today. Even before I show you the visual experience, you may have some guesses about what that was. Here we're looking at a capture from a coffee shop. And we know that the perception is very much coupled, right? The experience of the visual objects, the coffee maker, the barista, the other patrons, as well as the sounds that they make, right? So we'd like to be able to make use of this. It's a great opportunity to have these simultaneous signals. And it would meet our objective to have embodiment while doing visual learning. On the other hand, this is quite a challenge. When we look at the audio that comes with our visual observations, it's mixed together, right? There's a lot of things happening simultaneously, and we hear them all at once. So this is the challenge. What we would like to be able to do is have a representation of what different objects sound like, so that we could have a joint model about how things look and how they sound. And we could make good developmental analogies about, again, in nature, about building up naturally from the ground up models about different sounds that objects make. The question is, how can we obtain these in a natural manner, and including from unlabeled video? All right, in particular, we're going to think about this in terms of audio source separation. Okay, and there's a long history of work in this space, including looking at ways to visually guide audio source separation. The goal would be to take a video like the one you see there and pay attention both to the audio and to the visual, and then split the audio into its component sounds, such that for my example here, we'd like to have as an input a video of someone playing the guitar, sitting by someone playing the saxophone, and have as output two audio files, one that just contains the sounds of the guitar and the other that just contains the sounds of the saxophone. And you can see how if you have this ability, then you're on your way to learning object-specific sound models. Now, again, there has been a long history of looking at this problem, including with some visual guidance. But the traditional approaches have worked at aligning some strong low-level correlations between the signals. For example, the onset motion of someone with a bow of the violin could be a trigger to find some peak in the audio signal. And more importantly, systems that aim to learn about sound separation have required single-source audio to train. Right, you can already imagine a pipeline where if you've observed different objects making their sounds, each in a different separate video, that you could supervise this process and learn a sound model for each object. Problem is how to get such clean single-source audio from which to learn. Okay, so that motivates us to do the following. We'd like to be able to leverage visual objects in unlabeled video to learn about the sounds they make. And this unlabeled video, it's important to stress, will have multiple objects making multiple sounds at once in each clip. Okay, so unlabeled video comes in, and we'd like to come back with models for the sounds that each of the objects observed in any of the videos makes. Okay. So this is the goal. Let me show you how we're going about doing this, and then I'll show you some examples where this then allows us to do audio source separation from new videos. Okay. So the approach we set up is to learn this with a deep multi-instance, multi-label learning framework. Okay, so remember, we're trying to disentangle which objects make which sounds, but we only get to observe them when they're making sounds at the same time. So it looks like this. We have unlabeled video during training, and from it we can take out the audio signal. Here it's depicted as a spectrogram on the top in blue, and we can take out the visual frames. Now from the audio we can do some standard decomposition. Here we're using non-negative matrix factorization on that spectrogram data to decompose it into non-negative audio spectral patterns. And that's the picture on the top with the top right. So we'll call these the audio basis vectors. All right, so all we've done then is in an unsupervised way separate into the basis functions for the audio that's been observed. Now on the visual stream, we'll do some object detection. In fact, we're recognizing objects that are present in any of these frames using a ResNet classifier. Okay, so here we can find out for any given frame and for any given clip which objects seem to be present. For example, in this one, it may find a guitar and a saxophone. Okay, so you have these two streams, the audio on the top, the visual on the bottom. And now from here, we cast this in terms of multi-instance, multi-label learning. So if you remember, multi-instance learning means you have some ambiguity in the labels. Right? You have a bag of examples, for instance, where we only know that one or more of them is positive, but we don't know which ones. Furthermore, in the multi-label case, we have bags of examples and we know which labels are present, but we don't know which labels go with which ones in the bag of instances. So that fits here because we have a bag of these audio basis vectors for any given individual video clip, and we know from the visual stream weak labels about which objects are probably present. Those are the multi-labels. So from a network then designed to handle this MIML setting, what we can do is learn a mapping from audio basis vectors to the visual objects that may make them. Okay. And once we backtrack in such a network, then we can discover the link between the audio bases that are associated with each given visual object category that we've seen. And so that's all during training. Unlabeled video, as output, we get a set of sound models, one for each object that we can see. Now, given a new video, the goal is to separate its sounds. And here, we'll take those visual frames, we'll detect again the objects that are present. This one, say, we saw a violin and piano. And we'll pull in those audio bases that we have learned are associated with those different object categories. Then, looking at the audio channel for this new input, rather than simply cluster the audio bases that are there, we can decompose the audio in a semi-supervised way, which means grab those models that were discovered from the unlabeled data and use them to guide the decomposition of that audio signal such that the audio source separation is inclined to find the sounds of the objects that were seen in the video. Okay. All right, so let's see what we get. Here are some examples where we have trained on 100,000 unlabeled video clips, again, where there was multi-source in each video, and now we'll perform the separation. So this is the original video. And here's the separation. First, what we found as the acoustic guitar. And what we found is the harmonica. Okay, so you can hear the separation between the two. It's not perfect. For reference, here's what you get with an off-the-shelf method to do the audio source separation. So you can see this is a hard task. Okay, another sample, and if you're sleepy from lunch, maybe this one will do it for you. Okay, original video. And here's what we separate as the drums. You get the picture, right? Here's what we separate for the electric guitar. This is the baseline separation. And the final example I'll show you here, this is the original video. And what we see is the violin. And the guitar. Okay, so what happened there was the separation. In some successful cases, here's a failure case. Video comes in and our visual detectors think we see both acoustic guitars and electric guitars, when there's actually only one guitar and the separation is not so good. In fact, there's really not two sounds to be separated. And this hints at one of the challenges we still face in this work, which is being able to know when something we see is sound making versus quiet. Another failure case. So the original video. Here's what we separate for accordion, which is so-so. Okay. And again, some of these challenges are about knowing when sound makers are making their sound. Okay, so that's an array of qualitative examples. Of course, we've quantified how well any of this is going. And without going into the details, we can look at how we compare to off-the-shelf audio source separation, but also methods that are visually guided. And so we've got some of these studies, as you see here, and we take clean single source, mix them, and then compare that as our ground truth. All right, so in the remaining time, I will move from learning representations from unlabeled video with an eye towards embodied recognition to being able to learn policies for how to move. Okay. So this naturally suggests moving from learning representations and forcing them to be invariant to all sorts of nuisance parameters towards learning policies in the reinforcement learning sense for how to have agents move around a scene or move an object that they can manipulate. And this is, one version of this is the task of active recognition, being able to intelligently make motions that will help recognition succeed faster, which of course has a long history in the literature, but as we can see in the disembodied kind of benchmarks, isn't quite yet at the forefront, but probably we'll be getting there. So we've been looking at this first in terms of active recognition, where we want to learn a policy. At the same time, we learn how to represent our images. And this policy will tell the agent how to move around to recognize things rapidly. So this is an example, end-to-end active recognition. What are the modules you need in such a system? First, we have to have perception of the input, so some encoding. And here we have a convolutional neural network that will encode the sensory input. But we also need to have intelligent action selection, right? So the action space for this reinforcement learning task is what are the motions that the agent should make, or how should it move the object? Now in this cartoon, there's uncertainty. Is what I'm seeing a mug, a bowl, or a pan? But with intelligent action selection, the agent can move the object and receive a view that's more informative. Okay, and then the third module, after perception, after action selection, is to have evidence fusion, right? This is a recurrent process, so we will not only be intelligently sampling good actions to take based on the learned policy, but then we'll fuse the evidence over the sequence of views. Okay, and if these actions are chosen intelligently, that means in a small set of views and for the target budget that the agent has, it will find the right label quickly. Okay, so I'm not going into details about the model here. The main thing that we contributed in this work is to treat this in an end-to-end way, right? To bring together these three different modules, which you can try to tackle independently, to have them trained together. Furthermore, we put into this the regularizing property of egomotion condition view prediction. In other words, we wanted internally that the learned representations be predictable as a function of egomotion, just like you saw before. Now, using such a system, we can tackle a few different scenarios in our experiments. And one was to have an agent that knows how to look around a scene in an intelligent order, or to have an agent who holds objects and then moves them in an intelligent way, or similarly have an agent that knows how to circle or move around an object intelligently. Okay, so three scenarios, and in each the agent would need to recognize the object or recognize the scene that it's in. Okay. For those three scenarios, what you're looking at here are the active recognition curves. So the y-axis is accuracy, and you want it to go up quickly as a function of the number of viewpoints or glimpses that the agent is allowed to take. Okay, and so the sharper and higher, the better. The results that you see here are various methods from the literature, including some very recent ones on the right-hand side that use RGBD or depth data. And the end-to-end approach I mentioned briefly is shown in red. So this is a good step towards being able to have agents that recognize things faster. And if we zoom in and look at some examples of what these active agents are doing, how do they choose their motions? I can show you a sample here. So this image on the bottom left is a 360 viewing sphere that's been smashed down into a set of 2D tiles. Okay, so each tile, like this pink one that's highlighted, is what an agent will see in one glimpse through its narrow field of view camera. Okay, so in this one, it's looking at the scene here at a certain angle of the camera as depicted by the eyeball in the top left, and at this point thinks that it's at a restaurant or a train or maybe a shop, which is wrong. This scene is actually a plaza courtyard. Now, with the action space of being able to look next at any of the glimpses shown in yellow here, and you notice it kind of wraps around the sphere to the top, it decides to swing the camera in this orientation. From this next glimpse, it updates the posteriors for the different scene categories at the top. It's getting more accurate. And with one more glimpse, perhaps kind of swinging the camera to look where those people are looking, it sees this building and can identify the proper scene category. Okay, so on a training budget, learns a policy, how to move the camera, such that with very few glimpses, the right answer comes out. Similarly, for an agent who holds an object, this is a data set where a robotic arm, which is the thing you see in the foreground here, is holding one of about 130 different similar looking toys. And these toys are shaped like different germs. So at the first glimpse, it's really hard to tell and the estimate is wrong. It makes a motion of the robot arm to get a new glimpse that might remove some of that ambiguity, but still wrong. And one more glimpse, it removes that ambiguity and can recognize the object. Okay, and so these are great examples illustrating how we can move from learning representations that in one shot have the perfect invariant encoding for a snapshot to giving the agent the ability to not just glimpse, but to move around, look, and choose those glimpses intelligently. All right, so finally, what we want to move towards next is to go from having intelligent policies to recognize things where the task is predefined, the world is closed, and there's 130 germs that the system needs to recognize, et cetera, towards the scenario where we have agents that know how to look around new environments. So in such scenarios, we need policies that learn generically useful look-around behavior. And this is challenging because, as you might guess, training a policy with this supervised problem of categorizing objects or scenes has a quite clean reward function that we can inject. But here we're talking about trying to learn policies that will be prepped to do good tasks, good visual recognition tasks as they unfold. Okay. So in other words, moving from policies for visual recognition towards policies for visual exploration. And we've been posing this in terms of learning a policy that will actively select observations that reconstruct the rest of the environment. So briefly, the idea is not to optimize for object labels, but to be able to look around the scene in a few glimpses that most suggest the rest of the scene. Okay, that's observation completion. And why this might be a useful and task-independent policy to learn is depicted here in my cartoon. So if an agent has looked in one direction and seen these mountains and the boat and the tree, then there are certain places in the scene that are almost inferable immediately from those and aren't worth glimpsing, but there's others that in this sequence would be a lot more informative. So can we learn policies that will prioritize such views and in fact prioritize them in a non-myopic way? This means the agent has to decide where to look before looking there. Right? So in contrast to saliency, we need to be able to decide where to look before looking there and making some measurement. Okay? And for time, I will keep this short. The approach we've taken, you can imagine extending the one-shot reconstruction we looked at it in the early part of the talk to policy learning, right? Where we learn to have policies that will reconstruct the full scene. And this will allow us to look around quickly independent of the task. So here is a policy learned in this way, learning to look around a 360 environment, again displayed like the one we saw a minute ago. And what you're seeing is the observed views highlighted in red in sequence. So it has a budget of looking in 4 places, and that place is moving with the red rectangle, and then it resets. So at the beginning, you'll notice that there's a lot of uncertainty about its own reconstruction of the full environment, but by intelligently selecting a sequence of new views, that environment becomes most rapidly reconstructible without even looking to all of the places. In a similar manner, for an agent that moves around an object or who holds an object, here's what the agent reconstructs for what is actually a chair by looking at the first glimpse in the top left. It actively decides to look around towards a new view, shown over there by the red arrow, and then reconstruction improves. And then with another actively selected glimpse, here's its full view grid reconstruction. And the short story here is that if the policy is good, very few such glimpses are needed to get a reconstruction that's quite close to the ground truth, which in this case is the chair seen from all these angles. Okay. And finally, we can take these policies, and if we're to demonstrate that they truly are task independent, then we need not just reconstruct new scenes, but we actually have to apply it to behave in a new task. And so we have some preliminary results attempting this, where remember the policies that we just learned with observation completion. What if we take such a policy and drop it in to be the policy the agent follows to do active recognition? Okay. And we have good signs that this, in fact, is even competitive with the policies that are trained in a discriminative way for a closed world of object, meaning having trained beforehand, then we can drop these in to handle new tasks. All right, so I'm going to stop here. What I've shown you is ways in which visual learning benefits from taking an embodied approach that learns in an unsupervised and ongoing way, especially from unlabeled video. And we looked at these 3 different components. And all the work I shared with you today has been done with the students you see here, Dinesh and Rohan. Thanks so much for your attention. Glad to take questions and during the break as well if you have them.
Okay, we're just going to invite one question because we started a little bit late while our next speaker gets set up. So does anybody have a question? I was wondering if in the audio example you had, if you would be able to detect instruments you had not seen before in the training set, or if you could consider that extension.
Yeah, so the if an object can't be seen, then we would not have a sound model for it either, right? So all the object models that are discovered, they've been learned by their association with the visual detectors, right? So it's a good thought to see, even independent of the audio portion, you know, how new object models might emerge.